Is it a natural right or is it a legal right?
There is a fundamental debate, even among libertarians and Austrian economists, it's between these more rationalistic idea from Rothbard and Hoppe that property rights can be derived from logic itself, and you only have one form of property, basically, which can be rationally defined, which I tend to agree with.
Homo sapiens were mostly hunting and gathering their resources. So you have property, but this property is not well known. With writing, you have codes that are being written and put into place.
Scientific propaganda, like intentional propaganda during the Enlightenment. So there was like the black legend of the Middle Ages. So people like Voltaire and others making up stuff.
The one thing you have to keep from that time period is John Locke.
Here we have modern expression of property, a nice meme from Star Theory Flame, and it's suggesting that Bitcoin is this apex predator amongst all properties, and it's going to swallow them one after the others.
Something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong. The young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
The little young nigga doing bad shit. Talk much shit cause I never had shit. I could remember being whooped in class, and if I didn't pass, mama whooped my ass. Was it my fault? Mama didn't plan it out. Broke out, left me to be the man of the house. I couldn't take it, had to make a profit. Found a block, got a Glock, and I clocked bricks. Making G's was my mission. Moving up for this shit to get my mama out the kitchen. And why must I sock the fella just to live laws?
Now we can move to a very different subject. We can turn our attention to the notion of property. We've mentioned it several times. I mean, it's really at the center of the discussion here because in wartime, in those violent contexts, your chief priority is going to be to find out the best ways to protect this property, to save it, to preserve against confiscation, debasement, destruction, etc. So the idea really is we wanted to tap into the expertise of Ulrich. As he said earlier on, is an historian, is specialized in prehistory, but also history generally speaking. And since he's also passionate for Austrian economy, is looked into these notions of the evolution of the notion of property, and we thought, okay, that might be a good idea to undertake some sort of genealogy of the concept of property. You know, how does it evolve throughout human history? I think it's going to be a much lighter, much more descriptive part, less brainy in a way, and it should be very engaging. So we'll be tracking just the evolution of this concept from prehistorical infancy to its modern expression. Giacomo, do you want to take the floor and sort of prompt and get Uli to share with us his knowledge on the different periods that we're going to go through?
Yeah, sure. I think that it's very interesting that there is a fundamental debate, even among libertarians and Austrian economists. It's between these more rationalistic idea from Rothbard and Hoppe that property rights can be derived from logic itself, and you only have one form of property, basically, which can be rationally defined, which I tend to agree with, or the more Hayekian or Friedmanian idea that property is just some sort of convention that evolved in some ways but may have evolved in many other ways. And typically, I'm very curious to see your reconstruction of the genealogy of property rights. Most historical reconstruction that I've seen in my life follow the second framework. So it's like people just have resources and then they figure out ways with trial and error and some very successful ways to assign arbitrary property titles are these or those. While I think that it would be very interesting to try to match the historical evolution of property rights as the discovery of some logical rules about property, like the homesteading principle. I think that I don't know if you agree with that, Ulrich. Or sorry, I'm pronouncing it in the German way. Sorry, but I don't know if you agree with the more deontological and axiomatic deductive version. But it would be interesting to challenge to confront that with your reading of historical evolution. So I'm very curious to see the way you go on with the steps.
Yeah, so I think you can see it both ways. Before talking about private property, you have to consider how yourself you see property. Is it a natural right or is it a legal right? So is property intrinsic with the human being, or is it something that is allowed by the government or other individuals than you? Because how you see property is going to define how you are going to make the genealogy of property. Because if you think property is a natural right, like I think I think everybody here is thinking, there is no genealogy of property. Because property is property. That's it. So everything that we can tell you about the history of the genealogy of property is from the legal standpoint of view. It's not from the point of view of natural rights. So there's a lot of things that can be said about how property evolved and how we...
You can do some sort of a genealogy of the expressions of property as a political system develop, institutional systems, technology. So there are new dimensions arising with the development of society, and so property takes different shapes. In that sense, you can probably undertake some sort of objective genealogy of property without going into this axiomatic consideration. Now, I tend to agree with you, Giacomo, and I have to say that's one thing I'm sort of struggling with after I discovered Rothbard and the anatomy of states and that sort of thing. Okay, is I understand the logic that you're describing, and we'll come back to it, this natural right that you own your body, so the instrument that you build with your body is yours, that sort of thing. And I think it's kind of what you're saying, it's an awareness, a deep awareness, maybe some sort of spiritual or logic awareness of the reality of things, which has maybe been discovered by people a long time ago, perhaps is spreading as an idea undercurrent and surfaces at certain moments. And I don't know, it has to do with some level of shared level of awareness. And it's conflicting with more animal-based reality of predation and control. I don't know, something like that.
Well, I can make a very simple example that can conjugate this natural right proposition with an historical genealogy, which is the discovery of gravity. Gravity is not a convention, it's a fact. It's always existed from first principle of the structure of the universe. But the way people discover gravity changed from Aristotle thinking that the earth element was going to the center, and then actually Galileo trying to measure the acceleration, then Newton coming up with the idea that stuff falling here was the same principle of planets, of Kepler's laws. So there was a genealogy of the theory of gravity and of the engineering of how to use gravity, from trebuchet to moon landing. There was an evolution of theory and engineering, but not an evolution of the fundamental fact. And this may be something similar. We can have a first principle based fact, which is property rights, but we may have a historical evolution of the theoretical understanding of that and of the engineering of the enforcement.
All right, let's move on. So let's start with the very beginning, the prehistoric times. What does ownership, what does property look like in this very ancient time?
Yeah, so when you're talking about prehistoric times, you are talking about two eras that are very different from one another. There's the ancient one, which is called the Paleolithic era, and the newest one, which is the Neolithic. So the Paleolithic, the oldest one, is the time when in Europe and in the entire world, Homo sapiens, so our ancestors, were mostly hunting and gathering their resources, and they were most of the time nomadic people or semi-nomadic people. So they were living off the land. At the time when, like 20,000 years ago in Europe, the population was very scarce, like only 7,000 people living in what was Europe at the time, and mostly nomadic people. So ownership and property at the time is not known, obviously. The only way we can grasp it in archaeology is the burial sites, the tombs that we find, and when you see the belongings of the individuals that are going to follow him to death. So you have property, but this property is not well known and it's only attached to jewelry or certain kind of objects. So it's very particular. When we talk about the genealogy of property, you have to talk about the other part of prehistory, which is the Neolithic time. So the Neolithic time is from 10,000 years ago up till today, like I like to say. It is a time that people are going to settle, are going to cultivate the land, and they are going to raise cattle to live. And starting from this time period, we are starting to see a hierarchy being put in place, and we are going to see significant signs of property at the time, because when people are going to be sedentary, they are going to acquire land, they are going to settle, they are going to defend this land, because they are going to cultivate the land to get food. They are not going to rely on game to get food. They are going to rely on the land. So when you are going to rely on the land, you have to defend it, you have to cultivate it, you have to work. The notion of work appears at the time of the Neolithic. We don't talk about work during the Paleolithic, but during the Neolithic. And this is very important, because if we touch on this subject later, for philosophers like John Locke or Ayn Rand, the notion of action and work is the definition of property, because this is the work of a life of an individual that is going to touch the objective world, and this is how property is going to be born. So we can talk about it later, but this is starting from the Neolithic era that we identify property with work and with possession. And during this time period, we see hierarchy being put in place. We see a lot of megalithic architecture being put in place all across the world, in Europe especially. And what we find in archaeology is that people that are going to be buried in those megalithic architecture, are people that are considered to be wealthy. So they were the one with the most belongings and the most property. So what we know is that during the prehistoric time, the notion of property is not well known, obviously, because we didn't write the things, contrary to the Roman times and the modern times. But we know that property was most likely used by a very minority of individuals that were profiting from the work of others. And property is only that, it is what you produce. So that's what we can say about the most ancient times. When you talk about early civilization, one thing that is very important about early civilization is the advent of writing. Because with writing, you have codes that are being written and put into place, and you are going to formalize some code of law, the legal code of law that are found in Mesopotamia, in the Levant, in what is today the Middle East, and the birthplace of civilization, are quite interesting, because they are both the first expression of money that are being written, but they are also the first expression of what is property and how people can enjoy their property under the legal system. And at the time, what is very interesting, there is two examples that we put on the slide. The code of Hammurabi is a code that is well known because it was made by a king of Babylon, so the second millennium BC. And there's a lot of things that a lot of article of law that was put into this code. There's 82, I think, in total. So it is very wide, because this code of law is telling children have to behave with their parents. They are also telling people how they can inherit property from other people. So like if you are a woman, you cannot inherit from your husband, etc., etc. So this is put into law how you can have access to your property and how you can pass it on to other people. So this is quite interesting because this is the first manifestation of a state, a third party, as we can say, how they are going to tell you how you can use your property. And we can talk about it later, but when you have the first emanation of this, when you can delegate your property, when you can lose your property, is it really your property? This is something we can talk about later. And Egypt and Mesopotamia are pretty similar with the state owning land, temples, and because at the time, the state is very linked to religion, to the land, and people don't own land like they are going to do during the Greek and the Roman time.
Hey, Giacomo, feel free to interject anytime. I know it's your passion, this archaeology, and this particular subject, I'm sure, is dear to you. So feel free to interject, add whatever.
Just a few comments. I think that for later, especially when we will talk about Bitcoin later, it's very important to note this very strong connection between property and labor from one point. So we could say the labor theory of property, which is not the same as the labor theory of value of Smith and Ricardo. So property is connected to labor, and this is similar to the concept of proof of work in Bitcoin in a way, which is very interesting. And that's a very important point. Locke, Rand, again, other people, especially John Locke, was probably the first to formalize the fact that property is the factual connection between human action, human labor, and the result, the output of the human labor. So everybody basically recognized that instinctively since the beginning of history, but it was formalized pretty recently. And then the second strong connection is between property and speech. Like we were discussing how property became it became easier to analyze in the context of the written documents. But it's also important because while appropriating something, so homesteading something, is just a matter of working on that, and Robinson Crusoe can do that on his own island alone. It doesn't need to be recognized in order to appropriate something physically. But then the transfer of property, so the market, the contract, requires a concept of the possibility to alienate your property, to give it to somebody else, and you can give it to somebody else conditioned that somebody else will do something for you in exchange. So now you have a contract, and you cannot have contract without a form of speech. So that blurs the line a little bit, because while work, like changing nature with your action, is fairly objective, you have objective actions. A contract is based on language evolution, is based on the fact that people can understand each other, is based on, to some degree, to social convention. Even if I'm a believer of property rights as an abstract thing, the practice of contracts depends of a lot of social context. Let's imagine that you enter a cafe, you buy a coffee, and then after you drink it, the bartender will tell you, oh, by the way, the price was your life. Now you are assuming that there is a lot of implicit contracts, implicit conventions that are basically going to require mutual understanding. So this is very, very interesting, I think. And the other interesting thing is the use of state-owned here. I think I know what is intended, and I agree. But I think that when we talk among libertarians, this is tricky, because the word state that we use, especially to indicate the modern nation state, is actually a bastardization of the original word for property, which was basically a state. So we had this concept of land property that was an estate, and then the state for basically all over the Middle Ages was just land property. And so Ludwig von Haller, for example, is an historian and jurist, a Swiss one, who made the case, for me a very convincing case, that most of the feudal order of the Middle Ages was about private property, actually. And the concept of state back then was just the concept of private property of land. And then it was only the modern version of the word that transformed the concept of property in this concept of political hierarchy and military hierarchy. So in a way, the fact that in Egypt and Mesopotamia, all the property was state-owned is kind of tautological, because the word we're using for state back then mostly meant land property in a way.
All right. Well, we're going to be traveling those different stages. I think we're soon going to be in medieval time. In the meantime, we're spending a bit of time in Greece and antique Rome. What do you want to say about this period, Uli?
Yeah, so I think Greece is one thing, Rome is another. The Roman law we're still today deeply influenced by Roman law, at least in Italy and France, as you can say. But between the two, we can say that the Roman law, they developed property law that is very interesting because they also they develop a way, what was called the usufruct in Latin. So this is the way of using a land, using a property without owning it. And this is something that is very unique to Roman law. And this is something that we still have today in our code of law. Like you can enjoy a property of another without having the need of owning this property. The only caveat to that is that you cannot change the property beyond what the owner wants. And this is very important because it shaped how the Roman economy worked for centuries. And some Austrian economists, like I know Mrs. In Human Action, talked to us a bit about the Roman Empire and how this kind of how the Roman law, how it was shaped and how it protected property and the use of property among individuals. It was the base foundation for the division of labor and the specialization of competence that we saw across the Roman Empire and what made the might of the Roman Empire. And there's also another thing about Roman law that was called dominium, which was absolute property of a land, of a good by some individual. And during the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire, there were a class of individuals, the patricians, that were very wealthy and they used to own dominion. And this led to the domains that led to the medieval times after that, to the feudalism that we're going to talk about. And those domains were very interesting because they not only own the land, they also own the labor that worked the land. And this is interesting because they did not only own the land property, but also the labor that was put into place by people working the land. So it was very something that was very interesting during the Roman time. And some may say it was what made Rome an empire, and it was also what led Rome into its destruction. Because during the Roman time, we had a lot of inflation of money, a debasement of coins, of coinage, Roman coinage, and the concept of dominion was bastardized at the end of the empire, because the people working the land were no longer free, because before that they could left the dominion to go elsewhere. But at the end, the more the money was debased, the more the emperor intervened in the economy, and they even forced people to stay on domains, and the job were passed on generation, because people were seeking to flee, but they couldn't, so they put a control of individuals, and they totally change all the law work. So, well, this is quite extensive, so I don't know if we going to go into more detail, but yeah, Roman law is very important because it's still the Western legal tradition is still very influenced by it today.
I think an important point to make about this last discussion about dominion is the general point about slavery. So can people be considered as property? I think that even if slavery always existed also in Egypt, like the Bible, the biblical histories about slavery in Egypt or Babylonia, or even I guess in the Hindu civilization, Indo-Valley civilization, and everywhere. But in a way, we know for the role of slaves in Egypt, for example, has recently been rediscussed a lot. While we know for sure that in Greek city-states, the role of slaves was very important, and in Rome as well. So I think that's already something that can be compared to, for example, to the Middle Ages that you will address after. Well, I will comment this after, but I just want to anticipate that there is, for example, an entire class of thinkers, especially Christian thinkers like distributive thinkers like Belloc and Chesterton with the servile state, but also von Haller, and to some degree also Rothbard in Austrian perspective on of a history of economic thought, that are basically considering slavery as the practice of slavery as a vulnus in the conception of property rights that was later partially fixed with the servitude in the Middle Ages that gradually shifted from slavery into something closer to some kind of contractual agreement of protection.
All right, let's move to medieval time actually.
My specialty was not prehistory. At first, it was medieval times and modern times. And the feudalism is something very, very interesting because today, people, when they think about the Middle Age, the medieval time, they think of a society that was not very advanced and with very few individual rights and property rights. But as Giacomo said, there's a lot to talk about feudalism and how the land was worked and how work was considered by the hierarchy of the time and the state of the time. You have to understand that during the medieval time, and this is very different from the Roman period and the Carolingian period, which is the beginning of the Middle Age in Europe. Something happens is that charges, like both religious and temporal, were passed on generation. So you have lordship that are going to appear, and even some bishops are going to pass on their charges of bishop to their son, etc., etc. So you have this notion of heritage to give to your son your political or religious status, which did not really exist before the time. So that's something that is very, very interesting because property is going to be multi-generational, beginning with the Middle Age. And when a lord or the church owned the land, they did not own slaves in Western Europe, contrary to Eastern Europe, but they allowed people to work the land for them. And the serfs, or the peasantry of the time, they were relatively free people in the sense that they could leave the land they were working on. And this is very different from how dominions used to work at the end of the empire, the Roman domains, because people were captive of the land. They couldn't leave. And this is very, very interesting and very, very important to say because during the medieval time, people were more free than they used to be at the end of the empire and how they were later on, like during the Industrial Revolution or times like that. There's also one thing that we talked about the early civilization is that during the medieval time, at least in the archives I used to work on, there were a lot of contracts between the lords owning the land and the peasantry working the land. And oftentimes those contracts were put on the equal footing between the two. When you have a peasant, a serf, what we call in French a métayer, I don't know the English word for that. When they are going to enter in a contract with one another, they are going to be put on the equal footing. So this is interesting. And what is very interesting is that the serf has to maintain the land of the lord, but the lord also have obligation to the serfs. So you have to protect him because he's enjoying the labor of the peasant. So there is a contract about the protection, like the peasant is giving his property to the lord, his work, but but in exchange, he's going to get something, and something is safety. And this is how feudalism is considered mostly, how we study it in France, is mostly a contractual exchange between a lord and the peasantry based on contracts, kind of equality of a partnership between the peasantry and the lordship. So this is quite interesting, I think. And so for the other thing, it depends of the time period because the Middle Age is something that is very long, is 1,000 years old. So beginning with the end of the empire and the discovery of America for 1,000 years. And the law and how property was considered during the time changed quite a bit. But what you have to keep from that is that the feudal times were mostly, the peasantry was enjoying the fruit of his labor in a way that was not seen in Europe before during the Roman Empire. That's how we can put it in a way.
I think that Middle Ages are very interesting because they are a point in which I think a libertarian and Austrian perspective on history requires some kind of revisionism, historical revisionism, compared to the mainstream notion of the period. I grew up with, like many people listening to us, I guess, I grew up with the idea that there was the great classical antiquity, like Roman civilization. Then there was the dark ages of Middle Ages, where everything was bad and dark and everybody was dying of Black Death and poor. And then there was the Renaissance, especially in Italy, but also in French. Renaissance was when people rediscovered the greatness of the classical past. That was my upbringing. While the first time I had some doubts on this vision was reading again Belloc, the Servile State, in which he was making the point that it was actually the opposite, and many part of the good things of Renaissance actually were the direct consequences of the scientific and social discoveries of the feudal period, and many of the problems of the feudal period were actually the fallout of the problem of the centralization of the late Roman Empire. So the trouble created by the centralized classical times were actually responsible for many of the bad things, and the Middle Ages were actually responsible of many of the good things of the so-called Renaissance, including innovation in arts and science. Then I read Rothbard, Austrian economy, Austrian perspective on economic thought before Adam Smith, Volume 1. You can get it free from Mises.org, just like Money, Sound and Unsound. And you can read Rothbard on Middle Ages, which I think is very, very interesting. Then there is an Italian author, which is Guglielmo Piombini, specialized in this. I think, I don't know if he has been translated, but very, very interesting as well. Then I got to read, I don't remember who it was, but the libertarian thinkers about medieval Ireland. So the Tuatas, that basically are a form of non-territorially contiguous kingdoms, with the Brehon law, which is something which is the closest possible to a free market, pure free market order we can imagine, where you could actually join a kingdom with your property at distance. So you can join different kingdom from non-territorially contiguous. And then there is the discussion by, I think, David Friedman about medieval Iceland, with the whole thing and the things. And then I finally discovered von Haller, which is very unknown. Again, Ludwig von Haller, but is incredible because it basically makes the point that feudalism basically means contractualism. Feudal is like built on top of trust-based contracts. So it's a very interesting period for libertarians, I think, and Austrian thinkers. And I think that the way it's presented is upside down, mostly for two reasons. One was a scientific propaganda, like intentional propaganda during the Enlightenment. So there was like the black legend of the Middle Ages. So people like Voltaire and others making up stuff, like most of the things we associate with the Middle Ages, like Ius Prime Noctis, all this stuff were like historical fakes that has been built in the late 18th century. And then there is also some kind of less intentional and more natural bias, which is the fact that it's hard to understand chaotic and rich and diverse things. It's easier to understand centralized things. So when we think, for example, when we study history, if we think about one ruler controlling everything top down in a very centralized way, that's easy to understand. So it sounds ordered to us. While if we think about something more various, like the Middle Ages were very polycentric. If you were a peasant, of course, you didn't have much power or influence or control over your life, but you had a lot of competition for justice, for example, because usually very close to your, maybe you were in the territory of one king, but very close there was another king, and then very close there was an abbot, which was not the king, depending directly from the church. And then there was the bishop of the secular church, and there was the abbot of the spiritual orders that were often independent from the bishop and the secular church. They were both depending from the pope, but then you had the imperial free cities, and then you have the cities in general, the towns. So you had the Templar Knights. You had a lot of polycentric structure. You didn't have the state, the cop with the weapons. You had a lot of different structure, which creates a lot of interesting opportunity for freedom, but also a lot of complexity. So when you think about that, it just seems like chaos. So if you ask people which thing lasted more in time, the Roman Empire or the Irish Brehon law that I described before, and they will probably tell you, well, the Roman Empire seems something like solid, something standing, ordered. Well, it's the other way around. The Brehon law this kind of polycentric law in Ireland lasted 1,000 years basically until the Norman conquest, and the Roman Empire was way shorter in time. So it's very interesting. I think the Middle Ages is something that I would urge our listeners to really reevaluate from an Austrian and libertarian perspective.
Let's move on. We are actually reaching this period of Renaissance which has produced a lot of fake history, as you suggest, right? And basically, just a bit conscious of time. It's 2 hours 30. I think we need to really speed up a bit.
Yeah, but the medieval time is very, very interesting because you could vote with your feet, which is everything that you need. So the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, we can go a little bit quicker if you want. But the one thing you have to keep from that time period is John Locke. That's pretty much what you have to keep, because John Locke is the one that redefined how property works, or we can still think about it today. Because before, at the beginning of the talk about property and the genealogy of property, I talk about Locke and Rand, of course, because both of them are very linked, and they redefine property with the individual. Property, to put it simply, comes from the individual of the person, as long as a person enjoys his life to the fullest, so the freest life that he can have. If he can own the body, if he's allowed by other individual and the state to pursue his way to happiness, is pretty much everything that he needs, because the work is going to perform, the labor that he's going to perform is going to create property in a sense, because property is going to spring from what he's going to do with the world, with his reason. That's how Rand pretty much said that with our philosophy, objectivism. Everything starts with the human reason, with a right to life, pretty much. And from the right to life and the right to work, there's property that is going to be derived from that. And Locke also talked about something that is interesting. He talked about mixing labor, which is when someone is going to add his labor to a foreign object. The object is going to become his property, because he's going to shape it to his will. And as long as you work the land, or as long as you shape an object, you are going to own it. It's going to be your property. And this is how Rothbard talked also about property. When Rothbard talked about, like, Columbus, for instance, arriving in the Americas in the late 15th century, Columbus didn't have the right for the land, because the land was already worked by people, and the true owner of the land were the ones that were working it, pretty much. This is what to put it quickly is what you have to, I think, to grasp from the Enlightenment, is pretty much John Locke that put the emphasis on the individual, and our property was not given by a state to someone, or by tradition, or by the right of birth, but was something that comes from the individual, from life. And Locke is also very, very interesting and very different from someone like Rand, because for Locke, everything is mixed with religion and obligation to God, because everything was given by God, obviously. And Ayn Rand was pretty different in our approach about property. So yeah, I'm just going to say that, to be quick about it. But I think we can talk about Locke and Rand for a long time if we need to.
And yeah, there was the notion that the growth of trade imposed more formal property right, intellectual property, patents, copyright. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. At the time, property is also going to be about something that are not material, like like intellectual rights, patents, copyrights, etc., are going to appear at this time period. And this is something interesting, like when we talk about Bitcoin also, because property can also be exerted on something that is not tangible. This is very important, and this appears during this time period also. Yeah.
This is also a potentially controversial part that can be not now, but can be expanded on in another round table. Because, for example, much of modern Austrian and libertarian thinkers like Kinsella and Hoppe are very much against the concept of intellectual property as something because it's not scarce, so you cannot establish rivalry. And part of this debate is also based on historical revisionism. So is it true that it was patents bringing on the commercial revolution? Maybe yes, but if yes, at what cost? What is what you cannot see of the imposition of copyright and patents, which is also connects with the Bitcoin ideology of open source, like connected with the free software ideas of Stallman's and other. So yeah, this is also another pretty deep rabbit hole.
Yeah, we move to industrial revolution, toward modern times.
Yeah, well, the modern times, well, the notion of property is going to be more materialistic with the advent of Marxism in the 18th century, obviously. So the 19th century is pretty interesting because there's a lot of technological advance at the time. There's a lot of the structure of capital is going to be more complex. There's going to be way more capital goods that are going to be involved in the production of consumer goods and in global output of the economy. And at the time, you have people, philosophers like Marx, that are going to say that property is derived from labor, for example.
Or did you say value or property? Value is derived from labor?
Interestingly, for Marx, it's both, because he's building on top of Smith and Ricardo's theory of value in order to argue that the capitalist is stealing value from labor, because there cannot be value in entrepreneurial risk because it's not labor itself. So the misconception about property is about value is used to build a misconception about property. So you cannot own something if you're not the worker, but you cannot own capital, basically. You can only own the tools of your labor.
Let's move on and reach the digital age. With the rise of digital properties, software, digital media, and data become valuable assets with the emergence of concepts like digital right management. I mean, I don't know anything about that, really.
I'm not an expert on that either. But the only thing I'm going to say is that how can you put property on something that can be copied?
Precisely, yes. This is very interesting because like patents, but even more, all these digital right management things is based on the assumption that you need the state to. It's just like price control. In order to really enforce this kind of stuff, you have to assume a very deep and extended surveillance on private action of individuals and some kind of super monopolist of force. So before Bitcoin, none of the property schemes that has been discussed in the digital world were anyhow self-enforceable or sustainable without the strong government intervention, which I think is very telling about the rational foundations of these so-called properties. So I guess that the slide about the 20th century is really only complete in a positive sense when you actually add Bitcoin to the picture, even if Bitcoin is 21st. But
yeah, the 20th century is not interesting.
Here we have modern's expression of property. I think those are not exclusive dimensions, right? It's just so there's this I don't know what really we can gain, what sort of insight we can gain from this.
Well, I think that what we can do is to understand that physical property is about scarcity and rivalry of consumption. You cannot consume one thing at the same time of somebody else for two different purposes. So there is this kind of inner limitation of nature, which is scarcity, basically. If I do something with this, you cannot do the same with the same thing. So our use is going to be mutually interfering. While legal property is about power and arbitrary decision. I can tell you that if I can tell you that your body is my property and you're my slave, and you can find a lot of legal theories to justify these. For example, you can use the theory of democracy and the majority, but then one can make the case than if you are in a park at night with a girl and 3 rapists, and you have an election about property rights, the body of the girl will become property of the rapist because they are majority. So you have the majority rule that was one principle, or you can have other principle. You can have a theocracy with religious principles or whatever. Then digital property seems like something trickier because, as we said before, on one way, virtual real estate are just about arbitrary decision. For example, you participated to Second Life. I think that a very interesting point is the study of property in video games. That's very, very interesting. For example, Second Life in the early 2000s. You could own stuff, but it was always scarcity that was artificially created by the central controller of the platform. So by definition, in the digital world, digital means that what is digital? Instead of analog computers, you have electronic digital computers that are created for just one purpose, to make it easier to copy information and to correct error, basically. So in the digital world, copying is zero cost, and that or very low cost. That's the definition of digital. So how can you, in a world characterized by the easiness of copying, having scarcity and rivalry of consumption? I have a JPEG, I give you the JPEG, now we both have the JPEG, which is not even a variant, it's the same JPEG down to the single bit. We have the same thing. So you have two ways of having digital scarcity. One is artificial. So the controller, somebody who has an asymmetric control on the platform, will pretend that there is scarcity. So you have a house in Second Life. Technically, you can have a second house which is identical, but the game provider like Lindell Labs or whatever, they will prevent you from that with their power over the game, over the platform. Or Google will do it, or Microsoft will do it, or Facebook will do it, which is the same as
artificial scarcity.
Artificial scarcity. Well, Bitcoin, for the first time, is an example of digital natural scarcity, in the sense that it is artificial, in the sense that it is designed, but it doesn't require any kind of arbitrary enforcement by an higher authority. It's a cooperative game in which we are on the same field, but still our behavior converges over a rivalry of consumption. If I spend this UTXO, you cannot spend it because otherwise we break the scheme. So it is actual rivalry, just like in physical property. So I would say that Bitcoin is physical, at least in this sense. So this is a very interesting debate. Bitcoin is not clearly, I think that Bitcoin is not legal property in the technical sense. You can have an ETF or a MicroStrategy share, and that's legal property. But if you have control over private keys, so you really have Bitcoin, that's between digital and physical, because it is as naturally scarce as physical, but it's also in the digital realm, which makes it easier to transfer, for example, or to hide or to protect.
Yeah, there's a direct peg to energy, so to physical reality, and there's no legal aspect to it other than the social recognition, gradual recognition that indeed it is a property. Yeah, society is recognizing little by little, and you don't need to have a law for it, just people see it. So it becomes a norms, right?
Yep. Even if the law is telling that, even if the law of any country is claiming possession of Satoshi Nakamoto's, or this is similar to Craig Wright's situation. The fraudster Craig Wright go into a court saying, you court have to decide that those Bitcoin are mine. But the system doesn't care. Even if the court gave a reason to Craig Wright, still the protocol doesn't care. If you cannot sign, the economic incentives are such that people will not recognize the property transfer. And as you say, this goes back to John Locke, basically, because what is Bitcoin? What is a Bitcoin? It's a fraction of proof of work. So it's basically a fraction of homesteading principle, the proof that you did mix your labor with something, that you spend some effort, plus the proof of transfer. So the chain of signatures that from the original worker, the original miner, transferred this title to somebody else. And Bitcoin is in a sense the total abstraction of Lockean principles of homesteading and contract. So the transaction is a contract, and the Coinbase is an homesteading act.
And here we got a very nice slides too that shows key dimensions and tensions marking the evolution of property. So we have tension between ownership and use rights. We have tension between the physical and the abstract. We have a tension between the individual and the collective. And there's a move towards increasing formalization as well as economic function. Yeah.
I think that something we don't have the time to dig into right now, but it will be interesting for future debates. Is between communal to private, individual to collective, and prehistoric communal use. I think that's another rabbit hole, in the sense that many people have a very naive understanding of property, especially land property, as in, I own this land, so I own everything that comes up to this land, in like the cone that goes to the star and to the center of the planet. This kind of geometric view of property. While most ancient systems, and still even now the most common law systems, they use this concept of bundle of sticks. So you don't own like for example a field. You own different uses of the field based on your appropriation. If you build a road, you now own a passage right. But if you plant some seeds, now you own an harvesting rights on the same. So you don't own a place like a geometrical sphere. You own some causal fruits of some action, some causal chain. And that kind of, surprisingly, that's a more elaborate view of property than the naive one. But historically, that was also what was developed by most customary rules around the world. And in a way, it was reverted back during the beginning of the modern period. For example, with the enclosures in England, where there were these properties where some family had inherited the right of passage, some other family the right of disposal of waste, some other the right of harvesting, while the King of England arrived and they said, now wait, let's enclose this. This is only of this noble family, and they own like the dominion that we were talking about before. And this created
the difficult thing with this other approach, use-based approach, is that you may have some competing uses that may not coexist well together, right? So how do you administer this?
Well, that is where you go back to the property right definition. So it's not a solution to that, but you limit the definition of property to those specific conflicts. So the concept of property applies where there is rivalry. So if both cannot pass, then one has the passage right and the other should not have it. And homesteading principle and contracts will define who established the right before. If you cannot both eat the same apple, then there will be conflict. But in all the cases in which there is no conflict, like if you have the passage right in a common which is not conflicting with the harvesting right, then you can keep both. And societies were keeping both until some exceptions, like enclosures, in which the government intervened and basically distorted the incentives by saying, now wait, everything must be, it was again artificial scarcity. There were people going to the same land with different uses, and then the government stepped in and said, you cannot do that. You must, the land must be of this or this. And this actually created the problems of all the dispossessed people flocking to cities, and then Marxism. Well, even before the Dickens' time, you had this kind of new waves of poverty. Well, even John Locke was pretty much connected to the levelers. Levelers were these kind of early libertarians that actually started. They were called levelers because rhetorically they were basically tearing down the edges between the enclosures. So it's very complicated, but it's another rabbit hole. But it's also very interesting to me.
Yeah, one thing you can see it is what is the role of the state in property? Is property as an individual right beneath the state or above the state? If you follow what Ayn Rand says, she says like the state just have to make sure individual rights are still kept in place, and they are not used by the collective. But the collective, the state, has to protect individual rights. It depends how you put the state and his mission in the equation. When it comes to Bitcoin, I think if you consider property as a fundamental right, I think Bitcoin is the first kind of property that is fully compatible with the view of property as a fundamental right that is linked to human life, because you don't need a third party to use your property. So it is directly linked to you. And some Bitcoiners say that you are your Bitcoin. As long as you memorize your seed phrase, you are your Bitcoin. So your Bitcoin is part of your life. And it follows very closely Ayn Rand's philosophy and Locke's philosophy that property is something that comes from human life. And in that sense, Bitcoin is the first property that is very linked to life. No other assets is as linked to human life as Bitcoin, in my point of view. Kind of.
Well, that's a nice transition to this slide. That's a nice meme from Star Fury Flame, and it's suggesting that Bitcoin is this apex predator amongst all properties, and it's going to swallow them one after the other, starting by gold, real estate, currencies, arts, etc. So what can we say? I mean, perhaps to conclude this conversation, we've said a lot of things. To what extent does it disrupt modern forms of property? So you've just mentioned one essential reason. I mean, it's so close to a being, but can we go a bit further and say how it disrupts the different forms of property? How does it behave against the key dimension that we've presented before? I don't think we have the time for that. And how can it possibly alter the dynamics of war and violence? And that's the point we wanted to address, I guess, a main point we wanted to address. So perhaps we can start with this. To what extent does it disrupt modern form of property?
I think a very easy frame is that money itself tends to disrupt property, because money is a kind of property, but is also the most malleable kind of property, because if you can, instead of storing one instance of everything you may need in life, you just store money. It's the most liquid capital, and then you just buy stuff when you need it. So owning money during a regime of broken money was impossible or inconvenient, because money was inflated away, was confiscated easily, it was broken. But if Bitcoin fixes money, then Bitcoin goes back to be the most rational choice for capital allocation, because unless you are producing capital goods and then you're specialized, your saving will just stay in money, which is the most liquid kind of capital you can have. So Bitcoin is bringing people back to use money as the fundamental property. And in a way, it's also the second point, very, very rapidly, the way it disrupts the key dimension. I think that we already said that Bitcoin is not really, it's kind of physical. It's between physical and non-physical, because there is proof of work, which is a physical act, and there is the physical scarcity, the physical entropy in private keys. So that there is some kind of virtual. We can say that Bitcoin is digital, but it's not virtual. It is actually less virtual than fiat money. It's like Bitcoin is the de-virtualization of money to a degree. And then you have also this kind of disruption of individual and collective, because now, for example, there is a nice story. So the number 9 in if you print it in the right format with the right number of zeros in front, it's a valid private key for the SecP curve. So the number 9 is did move Bitcoins, and the corresponding address received and spent something like a few hundreds Bitcoin. So who is the owner of that? Everybody knowing the number 9. So that's an interesting paradox, because it's changing a lot the way we think about private property. If we publish a public key, now everybody who knows the public key in a way can act on the public key. So it is disrupting to some degree this kind of distinctions in many ways. And the last point, I think it's easy, because we went very deep with the previous discussion. If unsound money is helping create total war, then going back to sound money is at least undoing the damage of unsound money. So maybe we cannot fix wars forever, but we can at the very least remove the enormous incentive to total war created by unsound money.
That's fairly deep. Uli, do you want to add something on that?
Yeah, I agree with what Giacomo said. For the first time in history, people can protect themselves from war, from the seizure of their assets, from the devaluation of money. And this is very important because even if you win the war, you are going to lose. The war is always a negative sum game. So it doesn't matter if you win or if you lose, you're going to lose anyway. So, for the first time in human history, you have a tool that we can put our time and energy of our wealth into. This is Bitcoin, and this tool for the first time can be used without the need of a third party. And when I explained the genealogy of property, each time there was a third party. If you wanted to enjoy your property, you needed to go through the state or through somebody else. But for the first time in history, with Bitcoin, you don't have to go through a third party. And this is why I said before that Bitcoin is the first asset in history that is very linked to the notion of property as a natural right that springs from human life. Because in a way, you are your Bitcoin. That's a beautiful way to end this for me.
That's great. I mean, it's 3 hours, you guys. I wasn't expecting that this adventure would be that long. I mean, the first segment, I really could tell that this is so dear to you, this book, Money, Sound and Unsound, and you were debating or you were discussing each and every aspect. I can see that you've got it in your flesh. Same thing. I thought this genealogy of the concept of property was going to be fairly descriptive and quick. But I mean, you are appropriating these epochs, those periods of time in a way that just historian lovers do. And I think you managed to share this passion fairly well. So I bet this is the sort of content that will be quite interesting for the students of Bitcoin, although quite unexpected in all the subjects that we are addressing. I don't know how it fits within Plan B, network, platform, library, because I bet you have some connection with quite a few courses, and maybe that's the sort of conversation that can get people to step back and take a bit of altitude looking at this dimension of space and time in a way that that perhaps, the other sort of content doesn't do. But anyway, I'm super grateful for your participation, Giacomo. Next time we do it, I'll try to make sure we find a different tempo, or maybe we try just to embrace a little less, because this is actually maybe 2 or 3 episodes in one. Ulrich, I'm very glad we met, and I'm very glad you could be on stage today and share your love for what you do, and both in terms of history. To me, I see, the thing is, I was never a guy who liked, who was very much into history. And the truth is, it's only since I've discovered Bitcoin that I found, through the money, through this, this technology, this fundamental technology of money, I found really something that connects me to my ancestor. And that might sound cheesy or whatever, but that's the truth. I mean, this is the story of the evolution of money has helped me reconnect to my forefather and so on. So anyway, I loved it, guys. Thanks a lot. And
Thank you.
I wish you the best.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch soon.
Speak soon. Bye. Bye.
Bye.